The keys felt cold in his hand. He'd carried them for 3,000 miles, this final, gleaming proof that he'd finally made it, that he could finally provide. But as the golden light hit the two simple wooden crosses in front of him, he realized he was holding the answer to a question that no longer existed. This is the story of James Miller, and it's a collision of ambition, regret, and a silence so profound it became a tomb. His journey mirrors a painful truth for 27% of Americans who are estranged from family. But it poses a brutal question. What happens when you finally bridge that distance, only to discover the people you were building that bridge for are already gone? James grew up in Cedar Springs, a town so small it barely earned a dot on most maps. His parents, Helen and Robert Miller, ran the struggling local hardware store, a family anchor that felt more like a chain. Their world was one of quiet sacrifice, of patching roof leaks and stretching dollars, where ambition was often seen as a threat to stability. James saw it differently. He saw a ceiling. The final fracture wasn't a dramatic explosion, but a slow leak. It was a Tuesday evening. He was 19. He announced his acceptance to a business program over 1,000 miles away. His mother's eyes filled with a quiet dread. His father just stared at his worn hands on the kitchen table and said the words that would echo for a decade. If you walk out that door for some fantasy, don't expect a welcome back. James left with one suitcase and a simmering resolve to prove them wrong. The city was a shock of concrete and opportunity. He took the first brutal corporate job, a junior analyst in a cubicle farm. For 5 years, he was a ghost in his own life, working 90-hour weeks, skipping holidays, letting calls from home go to voicemail until they simply stopped coming. The silence became his fuel. He wasn't just building a career, he was constructing a monument to his own choice, brick by exhausting brick. By 30, he was a vice president. By 33, he'd launched his own venture capital firm. The money, when it came, was an avalanche. But in the quiet of his penthouse, a specific memory would intrude. His father, kneeling on the worn floor of their store, carefully repairing a cracked hammer handle a customer couldn't afford to replace. It was an act of futile kindness in a dying town. James's success was meant to be the ultimate rebuttal to that world. So why did that memory feel like a judgment? The idea for the mansion began not as generosity, but as a final argument. He would buy the old Miller acreage on the hill overlooking Cedar Springs. He would build something impossible, a structure so grand it would physically rewrite the skyline of his childhood. It wouldn't just be a house, it would be a testament. See, he hired a famous architect. He selected Italian marble and reclaimed oak. He approved plans for a wraparound porch because he remembered his mother always wanting one. Every decision was a line in a speech he'd never have to deliver. The project became an obsession, a secret he guarded fiercely. He told himself he'd reveal it all when the keys were in his hand, the ultimate surprise. He was orchestrating a grand homecoming, a moment of vindication so perfect it would erase every silent year. But he was making one catastrophic miscalculation. He believed time was standing still in Cedar Springs, waiting for his return. Back in the town he'd left, life and death had moved on without him. The hardware store closed for good 2 years after he left. His parents, isolated and proud, told neighbors less and less about their son. The story in town became that James Miller had made it big and wanted nothing to do with his past. It was a narrative his parents never corrected. Then, 8 months before the mansion's completion, Robert Miller suffered a fatal heart attack while raking leaves in his yard. Helen, already fragile with emphysema, was found by the postal carrier 3 days later. She passed in her sleep. With no immediate family listed and James's contact information long outdated, the task of notification fell to an overwhelmed county clerk. A letter was sent to an old apartment address. It was returned, stamped undeliverable. In the eyes of the system, James Miller had vanished. The community, believing he knew and didn't care, pooled money for 2 simple funerals. Meanwhile, James was finalizing the mansion's interior. He chose a vintage-style stove because it reminded him of his mother. He had a library built, knowing his father loved to read. He was, with every choice, building a museum for ghosts he believed were still alive. The final touch was a custom-made keystone for the fireplace, engraved with the date he left and the date he was returning. The project manager emailed him the completion photos. The house was magnificent, a palace on the hill. James booked a first-class flight. He packed a single suitcase, just like the one he'd left with, and he placed the 2 ornate, heavy keys to the front doors in his suit pocket. He was ready to deliver his masterpiece, He landed, rented a car, and drove the familiar, winding roads into a past he was about to conquer. He didn't go to the old house first. He drove straight up the new gravel driveway to the mansion just to see it in person. It took his breath away. It was perfect. Now for the moment he'd dreamed of for 15 years. He turned the car back toward town, toward the modest home he'd grown up in, his heart pounding not with nerves but with triumph. He parked out front. The lawn was overgrown. The porch swing was gone. The windows were dark. He knocked. No answer. He called out. Only silence. A cold, unfamiliar dread began to seep into his bones. That's when old Mrs. Henderson from next door peered out her curtain. Her face, etched with time and a sudden, painful recognition, appeared at the window. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She simply stared at him with an expression of profound pity. And in that frozen moment, standing on the crumbling porch of his childhood home, James Miller, the self-made millionaire, knew something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. The front door of the Henderson house creaked open slowly. Mrs. Henderson, now in her 80s and leaning on a cane, didn't invite him in. She just looked at him, her eyes holding a sadness so deep it seemed to have settled into her bones. "James Miller," she said, her voice thin as paper, "Lord have mercy, you're too late." Those 4 words unraveled his world. Standing on her welcome mat, the cold keys digging into his palm, he learned the basic, brutal facts. His father was gone 8 months ago. His mother followed just 3 days later. The funerals were small, she said, quiet. The whole town assumed he knew. When he asked, voice cracking, why no one called him, her reply was a quiet dagger. "We didn't know how, James. Your mama said you changed your number. We thought if you wanted to know, you'd find out." The guilt wasn't just his. It was a shared, silent agreement he'd never consented to. He drove to the Cedar Springs Memorial Cemetery on autopilot. The 2 crosses from the thumbnail weren't poetic license. They were real. Simple pine, already weathering, planted side by side under young oak. The dates confirmed it all. Robert Miller, Helen Miller, gone. The flowers at the base were plastic, faded by months of sun. No one had visited recently. This was the resting place of people already becoming memory. He fell to his knees, the carefully tailored suit trousers grinding into the gravel path. The bouquet of white lilies, meant for his mother's hands, tumbled onto the grass. He didn't weep. He couldn't. The shock was a physical block, a vacuum where grief should have been. He just stared, trying to force the dates on the wood to rearrange themselves, to grant him even a single month of warning. This was the consequence, made terrifyingly solid. His grand gesture was now a monument to his own absence. But the full, devastating picture was still coming into focus. James needed answers the cemetery couldn't give. He went to the town's only law office, a cramped room above the shuttered pharmacy. Frank Dobson, the elderly attorney who'd drawn up his parents' will decades prior, received him with a grim, professional courtesy. The document was straightforward. Everything, the old house, its contents, the meager savings, was left to James. Dobson slid a folder across the desk. Inside were the death certificates, the coroner's reports, and a stack of returned mail. Every piece was addressed to James. Letters from the county, from the hospital, from the funeral home, all marked "Return to sender." Dobson cleared his throat. "We used the address we had on file, son, the one from when you left. Your parents, they never gave us another." The system had tried, in its clumsy way, to find him. It had failed because he had severed the tether so completely. He'd forgotten he was the only one holding the other end. Then came the second, more personal layer of the tragedy. Dobson, choosing his words carefully, explained the circumstances. Robert's heart attack was sudden, but Helen's decline was slower, a surrender. After Robert died, she barely left the house. Neighbors brought food she often didn't eat. The doctor called it failure to thrive, a medical term for a broken heart. When she passed, it was the postal carrier who noticed the piled-up mail. There was no next of kin to call. The county took over. They sold the few assets to cover the burial costs. The old house was now technically his, but it stood empty, a shell holding 15 years of dust and unresolved words. James listened, his face a mask, but one question burned. "The mansion," he finally asked. "On the hill, did they know about it?" Frank Dobson looked down, adjusting his glasses. "The whole town knew about it, James. Crews from 3 counties worked up there for 2 years. It was the biggest thing to happen here in 50. Your mother, she'd sit on her porch in the evenings and just watch the lights of the construction vehicles up on the ridge. The image was unbearable. His mother, alone, watching the physical proof of his success being built in the distance. A palace he never told her was for her. Leaving the lawyer's office, James was adrift. He drove back to the hill to the mansion. It no longer looked magnificent, it looked grotesque, a 6,000 square foot accusation. He walked through the empty, echoing rooms. The custom stove, the library, the porch, every detail now mocked him. He stood at the massive window overlooking the town, the very view he'd paid a premium for, and saw his childhood home nestled in the grid of streets below. He had been up here, orchestrating this surprise, while his father took his last breath down there. He had been choosing marble while his mother was being buried in a plain pine box. The weight of the parallel timelines crushed him. This wasn't a story of triumphant return. It was a case study in catastrophic misalignment. His phone, silent all day, finally buzzed. It was his assistant in the city, emailing the day's urgent contracts. The real world was demanding his return, but he couldn't leave, not yet. He needed to understand the silence. He went to the town's diner, the only place still open. The bell on the door jingled. Conversations died. Every eye in the place turned to him. He saw recognition, then a swift, collective look away. It wasn't welcome, it was judgment. He was the prodigal son who hadn't returned until after the feast was over and the fatted calf was long buried. He took a booth in the corner. The waitress, a woman his age he vaguely remembered, brought him coffee without smiling. "Heard you were back," she said flatly. Before he could respond, an older man at the counter, a farmer in worn overalls, spoke without turning around, his voice carrying in the quiet room. "Nice castle you built up there. Shame your folks couldn't live to see you rub their noses in it." The words hung in the air, thick with a resentment he hadn't anticipated. His grand gesture, through the town's eyes, wasn't a gift. It was an insult, a gleaming reminder of what he had and what they and his parents had lacked. That night, alone in the empty mansion with only a sleeping bag he'd bought at the gas station, James did something he hadn't done since he was a boy. He prayed, not to God, but to the ghosts he'd created. He apologized into the darkness. He listed his failures like a ledger. The silence was his only answer. The next morning, driven by a need for any connection, he used the keys from the lawyer to enter his childhood home. The air was stale, thick with dust and memory. Time had stopped here. His high school debate trophy was still on the mantel. His mother's Afghan was folded on the couch. On the kitchen table, he found it, a simple photo album open to a page. It was a yellowed clipping from a financial magazine, a small profile of him from 5 years ago titled Rising Titan. Someone had carefully cut it out and placed it in a plastic sleeve. Next to it was a childhood picture of him, smiling, gap-toothed. No note, no comment, just the two Jameses side by side. The boy he was and the man he became, separated by a silence his parents had curated but had still, somehow, borne witness to. This quiet act of preservation shattered the last of his defenses. The tears finally came, wrenching and ugly, in the silent kitchen of the ghosts. He knew then he couldn't just leave. The mansion, the town, the guilt, it was now his inheritance. But a practical, horrifying question emerged. The mansion was complete, but he had no idea about the ongoing property taxes, the utilities, the maintenance. He called the county assessor's office. The clerk, after some clicking, gave him the annual tax bill for the new construction. The number was staggering, more than his parents' old house was worth. Then she said, "Oh, and sir, there's a lien notice here, a lien against his property, filed by a local plumbing subcontractor who'd never been fully paid by the now-dissolved general contractor. It was a small amount in his world, but it was a legal claim against the title. His perfect, cursed mansion was already entangled in the gritty reality of the world he'd left behind. And solving it would mean engaging with the very community that currently viewed him with contempt. His lawyer in the city told him to just pay it and list the property to cut his losses. But something in James rebelled. Selling it felt like a second abandonment. He decided impulsively to find the plumber. His name was Ray Perkins, and his shop was on the industrial edge of town. James found him under the hood of a pickup truck. Ray wiped his greasy hands, listening with a skeptical frown as James explained who he was and that he wanted to settle the debt personally. Ray didn't want a check, he wanted to talk. "Your daddy," Ray said, "helped me fix my well pump back in '98. Didn't charge me, just took a pie my wife made. Good people. I did the mansion job because I heard it was for them. Then I heard they were gone and you were nowhere." Ray's anger wasn't about the money, it was about the story. James, for the first time, didn't defend himself, he just listened. And he heard, beneath the anger, a shared grief for the people his parents had been. In that greasy yard, a transaction turned into a confession. James paid Ray triple what was owed. Ray reluctantly took it, but as James turned to leave, Ray said, "You know, your mom came by the site once, just stood there looking up, had the strangest smile on her face, sad but proud, never said a word." That fleeting image, a secret moment of his mother's pride, became the most precious and painful artifact of all. It meant she knew, and she never got to see it finished. Armed with this fragile, new understanding, James made a decision. He wouldn't hide in the mansion or flee back to the city. He would walk back into the heart of the town's judgment. He would go to the weekly town council meeting. It was held in the musty basement of the community hall, the same place where his father had once argued against raising the business license fee. He would stand before the people who had buried his parents and who thought the worst of him. He didn't know what he would say, he just knew he had to be seen, to stop being a rumor and become a person again, however flawed. As he parked his rented car outside the hall, he saw the locals filing in, giving his car sideways glances. His hands were steady, but his heart hammered against his ribs. This was the bridge he had to cross, but what waited for him on the other side wasn't clarity or forgiveness. It was a deeper, more complicated truth about his parents' final years, a truth held in the memories of the very people he was about to face. And one of them was about to stand up and reveal a secret that would dismantle James's understanding of everything. The community hall basement was packed, every folding chair occupied by a face etched with curiosity or contempt. The mayor, a man named Bill who'd coached James in Little League, called the meeting to order. The agenda was mundane: road repairs, the summer festival budget. But the real item was the man in the expensive suit standing at the back. James waited through 20 minutes of procedural talk, the tension thickening with each passing second. Finally, during a lull, Bill looked directly at him. "We have a visitor tonight, James Miller. I suppose you have something to say." All eyes turned. James stepped forward, his voice unsteady at first. He didn't offer excuses. He simply said, "I failed my parents. I'm here to listen and to make things right if that's even possible." A low murmur rippled through the room. It wasn't the grand apology they expected. It was an admission of defeat. Then from the front row, a woman stood up. It was Carol, who'd run the florist shop next to the hardware store for 40 years. Her voice was sharp, clear. "Make things right, James. Your mother sat in my shop every Tuesday for years. She'd buy a single carnation for your father's lunch pail. Every week she'd talk about you, not with anger, with a heartache so deep it scared me. She saved every newspaper clipping about you, even the ones that just mentioned your company. She knew about your first promotion, your first million, long before that magazine profile. She tracked your life like it was the only stock that mattered." The revelation was a seismic shift. His parents hadn't been in the dark. They had been silent witnesses to his entire ascent, collecting fragments of a life he'd excluded them from. Their silence wasn't ignorance. It was a forced, painful observance. But Carol wasn't finished. "The last year was the worst," she continued, her eyes glistening. "After your dad passed, she'd come in and just stare at the roses. She said, 'Carol, I think my boy is building a castle on the hill, but I don't think it's for us. I think it's to show us we were wrong.' She died believing her son's greatest achievement was a monument to his resentment." James felt the air leave his lungs. His secret project, his intended surprise, had been interpreted through the lens of their estrangement as an act of aggression. The mansion wasn't a gift. In his mother's mind, it was a weapon, and he had given her the final, heartbreaking year of her life to dwell on that belief. The dam broke then. Others spoke. The postmaster confirmed he'd personally tried to forward tax notices to a newer address he'd found online, but they'd been returned. The local pastor shared that Helen had asked for prayers for James's safety and soul every single Sunday, long after he'd stopped calling. A former teacher recalled Robert, in the final months, boasting with sad eyes about how smart his boy was, how far he'd gone. The portrait that emerged was not of parents who'd written him off, but of two people trapped in a prison of pride, heartbreak, and a love they no longer knew how to express. They had mythologized him in his absence, turning him into a distant, successful stranger they still fiercely loved. James had seen their silence as rejection. The town saw it as enduring, tragic devotion. Then came the bombshell from a gruff, retired mechanic named Doug. "You want to make things right, James? Then deal with the vulture." The room went quiet. The mayor shifted uncomfortably. "Doug, that's not on the agenda," Bill said tersely. "It is now," Doug fired back. He looked at James. After your mom passed, a developer from out of state came sniffing around, wanted to buy the old Miller place and a bunch of other lots to put in some cheap prefab homes. He had a fancy lawyer. He lowballed the estate, figuring no one was watching. The county was about to approve the sale of your parents' house to settle outstanding debts. James was stunned. He owned the house. No one could sell it. But Doug explained the chilling loophole. With James unreachable and presumed uninterested, a petition for a public administrator sale had been filed. It was a legal maneuver to clear derelict properties. His childhood home, full of memories, had been weeks away from being auctioned off to a stranger. The mayor, red-faced, admitted it was true. The town needed the tax revenue and the house was falling apart. It seemed like a clean solution. James's return had complicated everything, but the developer, a man named Grant Sykes, was not one to back down. He'd already invested money in plans. He'd convinced several townsfolk to sell their adjacent lots. The mansion on the hill, it turned out, had made the entire area more desirable. James's tribute had accidentally painted a target on his own past. Sykes saw the old Miller homestead not as a sacred place, but as the last puzzle piece in a lucrative tract of land, and he was prepared to fight for it. James, reeling from personal grief, now had a legal and ethical battle on his hands. He could either let the sale proceed, erasing the physical last remnant of his parents, or he could fight, and in doing so, directly confront the community's desperation and his own role in the town's decline. James left the meeting that night with a stack of business cards and a head splitting with conflict. The town's resentment was now layered with complicating sympathy and a shared enemy. He hired a local attorney to immediately halt the administrator sale. The next day, a formal letter arrived at the mansion, delivered by a courier. It was from Sykes's law firm. It didn't threaten, it offered. A purchase price for the old house that was triple its assessed value, a gesture of goodwill. The attached note was slickly menacing. Mr. Miller, we understand you're dealing with a loss. Let us handle the burdens of the past. This is a business opportunity for both of us. Don't let sentiment cloud your judgment. It was the language of his own world, the city's cold calculus, now being used to buy his ghosts. James realized Sykes wasn't just a developer, he was a mirror. An ambitious outsider seeing only assets and obstacles, just as James had for 15 years. Refusing the offer would mean war. James's city lawyer advised a countersue for predatory practice. The local attorney warned that a lawsuit would tear the town apart, pitting neighbor against neighbor who'd already agreed to sell to Sykes. James was trapped in a no-man's land between two versions of himself, the ruthless dealmaker who could crush Sykes and the grieving son who was responsible for the mess in the first place. He drove to his old house, sat on the porch steps, and called his most trusted business partner back home. He explained the situation. The partner's advice was blunt. James, it's a money pit in a dead town. Sell it to the guy, take the profit, and end this sad chapter. You can't fix the past by becoming the mayor of a cemetery. But as he hung up, James looked at the overgrown lawn where his father had taught him to catch a baseball, and he knew he could not comply. This wasn't business. This was penance. His investigation into Sykes revealed the true scope. Sykes's plan wasn't just a few homes. It was to buy up the entire western edge of town, including the hill below the mansion, and build a gated Cedar Springs Estates, a bland suburb that would fundamentally alter the town's character. The old hardware store lot was part of it. The diner might be pressured to sell. The mansion, his own creation, would then literally overlook the erasure of the very world it was meant to honor. The irony was savage. He had built a landmark that now attracted the force that could destroy everything left. In trying to build a tribute, he had inadvertently set the stage for the final act of his hometown's transformation into something unrecognizable. The weight of this unintended consequence was paralyzing. He had to stop it. But to stop it, he would have to become something he'd sworn never to be again, a part of this town. He would have to fight not just with money, but with a claim of belonging he had forfeited long ago. The battle lines were drawn publicly in the next week's local paper. A front-page story outlined Sykes's vision, promising jobs and growth. A quote from an anonymous town council member suggested James Miller was standing in the way of progress for sentimental reasons. The narrative was being framed, the emotional, absentee son versus the pragmatic future. James knew he couldn't win this from the hilltop. He had to come down to the streets. He started going to the diner every morning. He bought coffee for the table of old farmers. He listened. He didn't talk about the lawsuit or Sykes. He asked about his father's famous tomato plants. He asked who still had furniture his mother had refinished. Slowly, grudgingly, conversations began. He learned about the town's real fears, dying schools, young people leaving, the desperate need for something, anything to change. Sykes was offering a version of change. James had nothing to offer but a past he'd abandoned. The turning point came from an unexpected place. Ray Perkins, the plumber. Ray showed up at the diner, slid into James's booth and said, "You're losing. You're the rich outsider trying to preserve a museum. That's not a winning argument here." James asked him what was. Ray leaned in. "You own the biggest, fanciest building for 50 miles. You say you want to honor your folks. So stop trying to save a crumbling house. Start talking about what that mansion could do. Give people a reason to want you here, not just him gone." It was a radical pivot. Instead of defending the past, he had to leverage his cursed present to create a future. The idea was terrifying. It meant fully embracing the mansion, not as a shrine or a mistake, but as a tool. That night in the vast, empty great room, a new plan began to form. It was reckless. It would cost a fortune. It might fail spectacularly. But it was the only path forward that wasn't about looking backward. He would have to make a public stand, not in a courtroom, but on the steps of the very building that had caused so much pain. And he would have to do it before Sykes could secure one more signature from a desperate neighbor. He called a town meeting for the following Sunday afternoon, but he didn't schedule it in the basement. He put flyers up all over Cedar Springs with a simple, startling location. The Hill, 2 p.m., all are welcome. For the first time, he was inviting the town into the fortress. On Sunday, cars and trucks crawled up the new gravel driveway, a procession the Hill had never seen. People parked on the manicured lawn, gawking at the scale of the place. James waited on the massive front porch, not inside. He wore jeans and a simple shirt, the suit packed away. When about 100 people had gathered, a mix of curiosity and skepticism on their faces, he began. He didn't use a microphone. His voice carried in the clear air. "This house," he said, gesturing behind him, "was built on a lie. The lie was that I had to prove something to the two people I loved most. The truth is, I only had to show up. I failed. And now this place stands here, a monument to my failure." A heavy silence fell. Then he unveiled his plan. He wasn't selling to Sykes. He wasn't selling at all. He was donating the entire mansion and the 20 acres it sat on to a newly created non-profit foundation, the Helen and Robert Miller Foundation. Its purpose would be threefold. First, it would provide zero-interest loans and grants to local residents to repair their homes, start small businesses, or further their education, a direct antidote to the financial desperation Sykes was exploiting. Second, the mansion itself would become a community center and vocational training hub, with rooms for adult education classes, a commercial kitchen for culinary training, and the library open to all. Third, he would fund a full-time position for a community manager, a job he hoped would go to someone local. He would endow it with $5 million of his own money to start. He was not asking for permission. He was giving it back. The reaction was not immediate applause. It was stunned silence, followed by a torrent of questions. Who would run it? What about taxes? Was this legal? James had the answers. He'd hired the local attorney to set up the structure. The board would be made up of townspeople, the pastor, the florist Carol, Ray the plumber, the school principal. He, James, would have no vote. He would be a silent donor. The property taxes would be paid by the foundation. This wasn't a developer's flashy promise. It was a transfer of tangible assets, permanently removed from the speculative market. Sykes's entire project hinged on acquiring key lots, and the Hill was the anchor. By taking his land off the table forever, James didn't just block one deal, he changed the entire economic landscape. Sykes's plan was now financially unviable. The news reached Sykes by the end of the day. His response was a furious lawsuit, claiming James's foundation was a sham designed to depress property values and constituted illegal interference with business contracts. It was a bully's move, meant to drain resources and spirit, but James didn't fight it with city lawyers. He went to the county courthouse with his local attorney and the foundation's charter. He stood before a judge and said, "Your Honor, my only business interest here is in honoring my parents. This foundation is their legacy, not mine." The judge, a stern woman who remembered Robert Miller, dismissed Sykes's case within a week, calling it frivolous and vexatious. Sykes, outmaneuvered and out of patience, quietly pulled his options on the other lots. The threat evaporated. The town, for the first time, saw James not as a problem, but as a shield. With the external battle over, the harder internal work began. James moved out of the mansion and into his childhood home. He spent weeks cleaning it, not as a developer, but as a son. He didn't throw anything away. He curated. He found his father's toolbox, every tool worn smooth by use. He found his mother's recipe box, cards in her flowing handwriting. He turned the small house into a museum of a quiet, dignified life. It would never be sold. It would be maintained by the foundation as a historic property, a place for town history tour. In the process of packing, he made the final, heartbreaking discovery. In the bottom drawer of his father's desk, under a pile of old ledgers, was a sealed envelope. It was addressed to James in his mother's hand. The postmark was faded but readable. It was dated just 1 month after he'd left 15 years ago. She had written it, but never sent it. His hands trembled as he opened it. The letter was short. "Dear James, your father won't admit it, but he misses you terribly. I do too. We are so proud of you, even though we don't understand the path you've chosen. This town feels small to you, but it held our biggest love. You, please don't be a stranger. If you ever feel lost, come home. You will always have a key. Love, Mom." She had included an actual, physical key to the front door. He had been carrying 2 cold, ornate keys to a palace, while this small, warm key to everything that mattered had been waiting in a drawer for 15 years. He wept, sitting on the floor of that empty house, the letter pressed to his chest. It was the forgiveness he'd been seeking, granted long before he'd even known he needed it. It also contained the final, liberating truth: they had never stopped loving him. His entire narrative of rejection had been a story, he told himself, to justify his own choices. A year later, the transformation was tangible. The mansion was no longer silent. The commercial kitchen hosted a baking class taught by the diner owner. The library was filled with after-school tutoring sessions. Ray the plumber taught a basic home repair workshop in the great room. The foundation had approved its first 12 grants: for a new roof for the Henderson house, for seed money for a young couple starting an organic farm, for community college tuition for 3 local students. James split his time between the city and Cedar Springs, but his center of gravity had shifted. He was no longer the prodigal son or the rich outsider. He was simply James, the man who fixed the community hall's leaky roof without being asked. On the first anniversary of his return, he organized a simple gathering at the cemetery. He didn't invite the town. He went alone in the early morning. He placed fresh flowers by the 2 crosses. Then from his pocket, he took the 2 ornate mansion keys and the small, worn house key from his mother's letter. He knelt and gently buried them at the base of the crosses, a few inches deep in the soft earth. He was symbolically returning the keys, both sets. The gesture wasn't about abandoning the mansion or the house. It was an acknowledgement that the doors he'd been trying to unlock, to forgiveness, to belonging, to his parents' hearts, had never actually been locked. He had just forgotten where the door was. The story of James Miller isn't a fairy tale. The grief didn't vanish. The regret didn't dissolve. He still wakes some nights haunted by the parallel timelines, by the sound of a phone he never answered. But he learned a brutal, beautiful truth about the nature of second chances. They rarely looked like a triumphant homecoming to fanfare and open arms. More often, they looked like a quiet man on his knees in a cemetery, finally listening. They sound like the hum of a sewing machine in a room that was meant to be a formal dining room, as a local woman teaches others her craft. A second chance is not the erasure of a mistake, but the decision to build something new with the rubble. James built a monument to his guilt, and then, with the help of the very people he'd overlooked, he transformed it into a living bridge. The mansion on the hill no longer casts a shadow of regret over Cedar Springs. It casts a light of possibility. And James finally understands that this, not the silent palace, is what his parents would have called a true homecoming. James Miller's story is one thread in a much larger, often silent tapestry of separation. Remember, he is not an anomaly. He is one of the 27%. His journey forces us to confront a difficult universal tension. The human drive to build a future often demands a distance from our past, but that distance can become a chasm we don't know how to cross until it's too late. We frame estrangement as a clean break, a decisive choice. But psychology reveals it's more often a living loss, a slow bleed of hope where the person is gone, but the door in your mind remains painfully, ambiguously ajar. James lived with that open door for 15 years, believing it led to judgment. He only discovered it led to love when he finally walked through it, finding not the parents he imagined, but their enduring, quiet devotion preserved in a dusty drawer. So what does his painful redemption teach us? That the bridge back is never built from one side. It requires the unlikely, humble materials of the world you left behind, the memory of a plumber, the testimony of a florist, the shared grief of a community. You cannot redeem yourself in a vacuum. Grace, it turns out, is a communal project. The mansion ceased to be a symbol of guilt when it became a tool for his neighbor's dreams. His penance became purposeful only when it served a purpose greater than his own regret. This is the profound, counterintuitive lesson. We think we must fix ourselves before we can rejoin others. But sometimes, it is only in the messy, imperfect act of rejoining, of showing up, vulnerable and wrong, that we can even begin to be fixed. His story also dismantles the fantasy of the grand, cinematic reconciliation. There was no deathbed forgiveness, no last-minute reunion. The closure he received was posthumous, excavated from silence. It asked us a haunting question: what letters are sitting in our own drawers unsent? What pride are we clinging to that our loved ones might misinterpret as indifference? The tragedy of estrangement is that both sides often nurse the same wound, each believing the other holds the bandage. James's parents died proud of him and heartbroken by him, a contradiction they carried with a dignity he never knew. He had to learn about their love from near strangers. There is no greater argument for the risky, vulnerable act of breaking the silence, no matter how many years have passed. You take one thing from this story, let it be this: the time you think you have to make things right is a mirage. The future you are building for is not guaranteed to wait for your masterpiece to be complete. The people you are trying to impress with your success are often just hopping for your presence. The keys to the mansion mean nothing if you've lost the key to the home. James's ultimate inheritance wasn't a fortune or a property. It was a simple, devastating truth. Love doesn't expire, it waits. It gathers dust, it grows quiet, but it doesn't vanish. And sometimes, against all odds, if you are brave enough to return empty-handed, with nothing to offer but your flawed and sorry self, you might find it there, waiting in the last place you thought to look. If this story of a second chance found in the rubble of regret resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. For more journeys into the heart of the human experience, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for listening.